Mark out your grid in your book so that you've got 12 squares and label them ready. You're going to be doing an experiment in each square. So wet the paint, then load up your brush with paint. You might want to dry it off a bit because this is a dry brushing technique on a bit of paper towel. You can see to start with mine's a bit too wet, there's too much paint on there, so I've got it drier now and it's working properly. The next stage is wet on dry. So I'm just going to paint this square with any colour and then let it dry, and I'll come back to that one and paint on top once it's dry. Wet on wet is where you paint the square and then add more wet paint on the top of it. So I'm just going to choose a different colour, and while it's still wet, paint over the top. And you can see then that sort of bleeds in and blends into the colour underneath. Flat wash, your aim is to end up with a flat or even wash of colour throughout the entire area that you're painting. A successful flat wash results in seamless field of colour without a break, variation or flaw. So I'm just going to keep going from left to right with my colour, adding it on in stripes to try and get it as even as I can. For a graded wash, start with a darker, more concentrated paint colour. Paint across the top of the square in that darkest colour. Then do the next stroke with a bit more water added to it till you complete the square, so it should be darker at the top. So it's a very concentrated layer of paint now. I'm just adding a bit more water to my brush each time. Variegated wash. So wet your paper with your brush and then apply one colour in a brush stroke across the top of the square. Then load your brush with another colour and add another brush stroke, and those colours should start to merge into each other. So you can see it's already, because the paper's wet, it's already bleeding in. And then you add another colour and they sort of bleed into one another. For negative painting, you paint a wash of colour. So I'm just colouring all this in with my paint. And then, instead of painting the objects, you paint what's behind them. So I'm doing like a skyline, so I'm painting the sky in. Now, I've made a mistake here. What I should have done is waited for the wash underneath to dry first so that I could get a crisper outline. So I'll come back to that again when it's dry. For palette knife or stick painting, wet your paint and then dip the end of your paintbrush will do into the paint, and then you just basically draw in with it and you get nice crisp lines. For fading out, add a concentrated amount of paint to the top of your square, and then you're just adding water to that to spread it into the lower half of the square, and you get a bit like like a gradient with that. Glazing is when you add other washes of colour over the top of each other. So I've just decided to do this in stripes like a check. So just adding quite watery paint over the top of each other in different colours, and you can see how they merge into one another. For bleeding or bloom, wet the square, then touch your paintbrush just to that area inside the square, and the paint will bleed or bloom out onto the paper. For the last one, just put paint on your brush and flirt it at the square. Now I'm just going to go back to my wet on dry part, and you can see that's dried now, and then you can see that in comparison to the wet on wet square next to it, and it's a lot crisper, neater line. And then I'm going back over this one where I painted wet on wet for the negative painting, and you'll find that I can get it a lot crisper, neater edge now that it's dry. So I'm just going to go over that. Might leave some of it so that it's the more lighter grey colour.